Chapter 7. Wolf Attack. Early the next morning, Dan fed the dogs and put on their booties because there was a lot of sharp ice on the trail. The 10 dogs were jumping happily in the snow, and they were ready to go. Dan cried,
"Hike!"
and they were on their way to find George.
Now there are about 100 miles between us and George.
Dan thought as he drove the dog team.
This is the worst blizzard I can remember. I can barely see where we're going. Luckily, Spike and Queen know the trail.
Today was George's second day alone in the van, and his foot hurt more. He was worried. He looked at the temperature outside, and it was minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit. He felt lonely and looked at a photo of his kids and his wife that he kept in his wallet. It made him feel a bit better. After 4 hours, Dan and his dog team stopped for lunch. He heated some red meat for the hungry dogs. He changed their booties, and they were on the trail again. The weather was getting worse, and the blizzard was getting stronger. The trail was covered with deep snow and ice, but the dog team never stopped and traveled until it was dark.
We'll find George tomorrow morning,
said Dan, taking the harnesses off the dogs. He made a fire and started to heat some fish and meat for the dogs. Suddenly, Dan heard a growling noise that was coming from behind him. He turned around and saw a pack of wolves. They were growling angrily and showing their teeth. Their ears were low on their head. This meant that they were ready to attack. The 10 team dogs saw the wolves and started to bark loudly. Dan thought,
these wolves are hungry and dangerous. They saw the food and they want it.
He took a big stick that he always kept in the sled and put it into the fire. Now he had a torch, and he showed it to the hungry wolves. But the wolves weren't frightened. They saw the sled dogs and started to attack them. It was a terrible fight between the dogs and the wolves. The wolves jumped and tried to bite the necks of the dogs, because this is how wolves attack. However, Dan's dogs were good fighters, and they weren't afraid of the wolves. Dan didn't know what to do. The dogs were his only hope in the middle of the blizzard.
I have to stop this,
he thought. He ran to the sled and got his rifle. Then he shot it in the air twice. The terrible noise of the rifle frightened the wolves, and they ran away into the night. He looked at his dog team and saw that one dog was missing. It was Spike. He was lying on the snow, and there was blood on his head and on the snow. A wolf hurt his left eye. He was crying softly, and the other dogs stood around him silently.
Spike!
cried Dan, holding Spike's head.
Poor Spike. A wolf hurt your eye very badly. Who's going to lead the team?
Nicky started barking. He knew that he could lead now. Dan looked at both dogs and said,
Okay, Nicky, this is your chance to lead the team. You'll stay with Queen, and you, Spike, will take Nicky's place as a swing dog. You can do that with your bad eye. Now, I'm going to get some medicine for your eye. Just relax, Spike. You'll be okay. I'll take you to the vet when we get back home.
Spike looked at him with his right eye and stopped crying. After this terrible adventure, the dogs ate and fell asleep. But Dan was worried about Nicky.
Can Nicky really lead the team in this blizzard?
He asked himself.
He has very little experience. Of course, there's Queen, but she's not as good as Spike. Well, Nicky has to lead.
On the morning of the third day, Dan and the dog team crossed the frozen Yukon River. Nicky was the lead dog next to Queen, and he was doing a good job. Dan was glad. Shortly after, George could see the dog team running towards his van. He couldn't believe his eyes. Now he could finally go back to his family. Dan stopped the sled with a loud,
"Whoa!"
and the dogs started barking happily. George's foot hurt a lot, but he got off the van and cried,
Dan,
It's great to see you and the dogs.
George,
cried Dan.
we're here. We can thank these 10 wonderful dogs.
He looked at George's foot and said,
You need to see a doctor. Please, take only your computer because the sled mustn't be too heavy. Now you can get into this special sleeping bag and lie down on the back part of the sled. This way you can rest your back. I keep the other things at the front part of the sled. We have to leave immediately because this blizzard is getting worse.
How can I thank you, Dan?
asked George, slowly getting on the sled.
Don't thank me.
Said Dan, laughing.
Thank the dogs. Only they could find you during this blizzard. Are you comfortable now?
Yes, I certainly am.
Said George.
Okay, get ready for a 2-day trip back to Fairbanks then.
Said Dan.
Hike! Hike!
The two men and the great dog team started to fly across the snow. After a difficult 2-day trip, they got back to Fairbanks and were greeted like heroes. Everyone in town was very happy to see them.
Nicky passed the test.
Exclaimed Dan.
He's a great lead dog, and I think he can lead our team in the next Iditarod race in March.
A doctor looked after George's foot and told him to rest for a week. Then he could continue his work. A vet looked after Spike's left eye, but he couldn't lead the dog team anymore. Karen, Justin, Ross, and Mrs. Kobach decided to cook a late Thanksgiving dinner for everyone, including the 10 team dogs.
Why don't you come to Phoenix next summer, Ross?
Asked Justin before leaving for home.
Karen and I can show you around. There's lots to see. The Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, the Navajo American Indian people, and much more. There are always great rock concerts during the summer in Phoenix.
Yeah, Ross.
Said Karen, smiling.
You can visit our animal shelter and meet Dr. John Greenwood, the vet. And you can teach the volunteers about huskies.
Thanks. Sounds super, guys.
Said Ross, laughing.
I'd love to come. Hot weather at last.